Hello, and welcome to the South Coast Artists Index, where artists, performers, and writers, as well as curators, directors, and supporters, anyone with ties to the creative community, drops by to introduce themselves to you. We'll talk about their beginnings, their vision, their passion, and so much more. The South Coast Artists Index podcast is brought to you in part by Heavenly Spirits, who invites you to celebrate the art of life and creative communities everywhere.
Hello, this is Jeff Angeley here with the South Coast Artists Index podcast, and I'm sitting down with Brian Cass.
It's me.
South Coast Artists Index podcast is available streaming anywhere you listen to podcasts. It's also disseminated on social media and is preserved for the historical record at the Whaling Museum in New Bedford, for future reference of who is making what, where, and when. And that's enough of that. How are you doing?
I'm doing pretty well. How are you?
I'm doing all right. So we are sitting down talking music today. And where to begin? You currently have a bunch of different things going on. So why don't we start with what you're doing now? You've got a band, the Brian and the Cassettes.
Yep. You could say the Cassettes or you could say the Cassettes. Either way works great.
Yeah.
That's a rock and roll band. We play about once a month downtown New Bedford. During the summer, we get a little busier with the outdoor kind of events. I would consider that to be kind of improvised rock and roll. We don't rehearse. Sometimes I'll warn the rest of the band what kind of songs I'm thinking of playing, but a lot of the time I don't. So it's a lot of 3-chord kind of songs, recognizable covers that people will know. It's a lot of recognizable covers, but kind of doing like my Jimi Hendrix impersonation a lot of the time. Like, so we might be doing a Madonna song or a Bob Dylan song, but it's kind of through a Hendrix type filter. But then we have a few tunes here and there that the players have to do their homework on. Like we might do a Cult of Personality or a War Pigs or some other tune that has a lot of nooks and crannies just to mix it up so that it's not all really basic songs. But we wrestle on the drums and a rotating cast of bass players. Mark Friedman, Rob Massoud, Kyle Spark. Brought Mike Jupin out of retirement recently for one.
Oh, yeah. That's great.
He'll only do the daytime summer ones, but I figure if I can get him out once a year, that's pretty good.
Yeah.
And then there's a lot of people that sit in. Normally Mike Gallen on trombone, Dave Minton on sax, Kat Knutson sometimes on flute. Occasionally we'll get a Rick Smith on trumpet if we're lucky, because he travels a lot.
Yeah, he's got a crazy schedule.
Yeah, but that's Brian and the Cassettes. That's pretty much all we do. We just show up once a month and try to rock out.
Yeah, awesome. And you're also teaching at Berklee?
I'm teaching at Berklee. I've been there 10 years now. Last year and a half I've been full-time. And I teach electronic production and design, which is the same major that I studied when I was there, but at the time it was called music synthesis. When the department was originally formed, it was primarily synthesizers. When I was there in the 1990s, it was computer-centric, but not in the way we think of it now. You're recording us onto your laptop, but it was a little different. It was a little more offline what we were doing back then. We could record pretty basic stuff, but there weren't a lot of plugins or anything. We were mostly using computers to generate sound, kind of like we were using computers instead of synthesizers. So you'd type up a bunch of code and cook it and come back an hour later to see what it compiled and what it sounded like. If you wanted to change a line of code, then you come back an hour later and see how it sounds different. That's the kind of thing we were doing back then. But after I graduated, I spent a lot of time in recording studios. And now when I came back to Berklee to teach in that department, there's a lot more of that happening. So we have studios, and they learn to use microphones, and they learn how to sample and how to track and how to mix and edit, and as well as all the synthesizer-ly kind of things. So I get to teach a lot of different stuff. I'm kind of the Swiss Army knife of the department in that I've taught most of the classes that we offer, the core classes at least. But I specialize in the sampling course, and I'm also currently responsible for a course called Intro to Music Technology, which is a beast because it's a course that every Berklee student takes, not just the ones that are interested in technology. So it's kind of like a GarageBand and then Logic Pro class for every Berklee student in their very first semester. So I'm responsible for keeping that kind of up to date, and a wide variety of faculty plugged into it, because there's a lot of sections of a class like that. There's so many incoming students every semester. But that's been a great job. I really enjoy it. I've always enjoyed teaching,
That program's, what was the title of the program again?
The department is electronic production and design. And so that's a major that you can declare at Berklee. It's also the department that I work in. And it gets a little bit complicated because we've now introduced this performance wing as well. When I was there in the 1900s, you declare a principal instrument as well as a major. So you could declare bass clarinet as your instrument, and you could choose songwriting as your major. Myself, I was a guitar principal, and then music synthesis was my major. But now you can declare electronic digital instrument as your instrument, which is essentially like a computer with a controller,
right,
or a modular synth, or just a few samplers. That it's got to be a sort of a network of kind of customized stuff.
I had a friend tell me that even Lowell now, and Lowell's like a really traditional program, always has been, is letting people audition on essentially laptop. So
yeah, the big hurdle that we've had to get over with that is when a kid shows up for that audition, they can't just hit the space bar and play us a track they made.
Yeah.
Right. They've got to be able to play in time. They've got to be able to pitch match, like you play a line for them, they can play it back, we hit a bit of a stumbling block years ago because I'm not going to name names, but someone that used to work with us at Berklee tried to push turntablism as a principal instrument. And I think that was unrealistic. Like, you can do a lot with a turntable, and I'm not trying to be dismissive of that as an art form at all, but it's very difficult. There's not too many people that can play giant steps on a turntable, unless, again, you're just putting on John Coltrane and letting it play,
right,
you know what I mean? Which is the space bar, right?
Yeah.
But to actually be able to play a melody and improvise, that requires just some more buttons, and so that's where we're finally at now. We did a lot of studying of the requirements, the proficiency exams from semester to semester for drummers. And we kind of combined that with some of the things that a more tonal instrument would do. So when the EDI, which is electronic digital instrument players, come in for their proficiency exams, they're required to play certain grooves, drum beats, and then maybe do it with just their left hand while they play some chords with their right hand. It's not easy.
Yeah.
But it's really happening now. So that also lives in our department, even though it's kind of a separate wing, because that's an instrument. You could actually go to Berklee and declare your principal instrument as EDI, but not declare our major. You could be a jazz arranging major and an EDI principal. It's kind of interesting.
Yeah. Now, I have seen you do performance stuff with electronic digital instruments. Is that something that you started before you were at Berklee?
Yeah. When I was little, I had a Commodore 64, and that thing blew my mind. I mean, as far as just having those kind of video games in my home, it was fascinating. In hindsight, the games are not as fascinating as they seemed at the time, compared to modern video games. But the sound really spoke to me. I liked the way Atari sounded. I liked the way arcade games sounded. But the Commodore 64 had this really special sound chip in it. It's called the SID chip, if anyone wanted to look it up. Sound interface device. But I did have a program that I could load on a floppy disk on the Commodore 64 that allowed me to manipulate the SID chip like a synthesizer. So I didn't know anything about it.
Using the keyboard?
Yeah, and some on-screen, not a musical keyboard, but like the Commodore 64, it was like a big fat keyboard. The computer was built into the keyboard, right?
Yeah, I had one actually.
So you could play some melodies using the keys, if I recall. But there were also ways to manipulate some on-screen things like the filter cutoff and the LFO and the wave shape. And I didn't know what any of those things really meant, but I messed around with it until I could kind of fabricate some of the sounds I heard in the games that I loved so much. So in a way, I almost want to say that was my first instrument before guitar, because it was, several years later that I got into guitar really. And then when I was in high school, I went to Westport High School in, would that be like 91 to 95? And Scott Frost was in charge of the music department there. I think he still teaches at Symphony, I believe.
I don't know.
Scott Frost, he's a drummer. He's a great guy. He definitely had a major influence on me. And a friend of mine that was maybe a year or two ahead of me in high school, John Macaron, the three of us went in and talked to this new principal that came in. And we pitched this idea to put together like a MIDI lab next to the band room. And somehow it went through, and we had like 4 or 5 computers and some synthesizers. We had a sampler. And I basically spent my junior and senior year of high school locked to that sampler, just loading everything I could into it, chopping up drum beats. And so that's when I really got into performing with it. But it wasn't really as portable. It was still very much like you're in the lab for hours to create something. But I was doing my best to make it as performative as I could.
Were the things that you were creating at that point, were they recorded things? Were you recording everything that you were doing?
So at that point, we couldn't really record audio to computers. We would record the MIDI on computers, and you'd have to run the MIDI out to synthesizers and samplers to actually generate the sound. Yep. But then I could record that to tape. And so, I was making a lot of tracks. I would do my best to perform some of it in real time. Like as some of these things are playing back, then I'm playing something on top of it so that it has some life to it. And when I listen back to some of those old tapes, I realize, I'm in there in this little lab that's connected to the band room. And, Westport High School had a really good marching band, really good, like award-winning drum line, no football team. So just a band that played in band competitions, never played a football game, but when I listened to some of those old tracks, I listened to the drum programming, and it's like somewhere between like 9 Inch Nails, like industrial kind of Ministry kind of sound, and drumline. There's like lots of layered snares doing weird rudiments and stuff, which at the time I didn't even realize that was unusual. But because it's, I was surrounded by it.
Did you play in the school band?
Minimally. Yeah. I mean, I played guitar most of the time. I did some drumline stuff where I'd play drums. I did spend a little bit of time studying other instruments. I took some lessons in trumpet and saxophone, clarinet, just because I wanted to understand how they worked. I never got great at any of them, but I would occasionally play for, a winter concert or something. I'd play some other instrument, but I definitely wasn't like I was band adjacent
Yeah,
You know, quite literally, because I was in the room next door.
Yeah.
So those were all my friends, but they would just kind of peek in and be like, "What are you doing in the laboratory today?"
Yeah. When did you pick up the guitar? Was that in high school?
I think of it as being when I was 12.
Okay.
That's when Metallica and Iron Maiden spoke to me and said, you must play guitar. But my dad played my whole life. He was like a surf rocker back in his day. So he always had guitars around. He definitely taught me pipeline earlier on when I was maybe like 8 or 9. Probably House of the Rising Sun. And my sister played a bit. She's older than me. So I was noodling, but I hadn't gotten past the part where I complained about my fingers hurting.
Yeah.
You know, that it wasn't until I was 12 that it was like, okay, I'm gonna really go for it. And then I started taking lessons from Jimmy Tavares, who is a local legend.
Yeah, and did you play in bands when you were in high school? Did you have any rock bands or otherwise bands?
Yeah, so I guess when you're 12, what is that? That's like 7th grade-ish?
No, he's 12. That's, 7th grade.
So by the time I got to high school, 9th grade, I had this best friend at the time, Greg Costa, who I've since lost track of, but he and I both started playing guitar around that time, and we both took it very seriously. And so we could play a lot of the Metallica and the Iron Maiden tunes that we were into. I mean, those were the big ones for us. You know, maybe a little bit of Slayer, but mostly Metallica, Iron Maiden. And TW, you know TW.
Yeah.
We used to play with him. And when we got to high school, there was a bit of a scramble where all these high school bands were like, oh, there's these 2 freshman kids that can play guitar. Like and then everybody was trying to get us in their band. So we each ended up in a separate band with much older kids.
Yeah.
And that became the trend for me for like the next 4 or 5 years. Like I was always in bands with older people just because I started sooner and took it more seriously. But you know, I'd get rides and get dropped off, and everybody be laughing at the fact that I was too young to have my own car and have a license or anything. But a lot of those gigs were, you know, I don't know what the modern equivalent of it is, but back then there were a lot of those all ages shows.
Yeah.
Where so many of us got to start, because, you know, these days, a lot of the places that I play, you got to be 21 to get in there. I mean, I guess there's like the Morrissey kids. They can play out a lot of places.
Playing bars and stuff. Yeah, I don't know what you guys were doing in Westport. I know in Taunton we were playing like, you know, Italian Social Club and VFW and things like that were set up specifically to be those kind of shows. I don't know that that's not happening right now. That could be like one of those things that's happening and we just like, that's like not in our world, you know what I mean?
Different radar.
Yeah, it could be, but it could be not happening too. I don't know. It's an interesting question because, you know, that comes down to a question of like how many people are really making live music. Yeah,
there's probably more kids in their basement making beats together.
Yeah, that's really possible.
Homegrown hip hop is probably more likely what's happening, but I mean, in those years there wasn't a lot going on in Westport. I mean, there was a few bands that were Westport based, I guess, but once I got exposed to New Bedford, I was pretty much playing in New Bedford. So it was VFW's here, and it's a place up in Acushnet that's a church now. I think it used to be called the Highlander. Did a lot of stuff there.
Yeah.
There was always, it seemed like every weekend there was somewhere to go, either play or see people play. There was a place on the bridge on Cogsall Street in between Fairhaven and New Bedford. I think it's the Donut Place now.
Oh, yeah.
Actually, I think they tore it down and that building is a new building. But on that lot, there was a place that was owned by Randy. I forget Randy's last name. Most local musicians from back then will remember Randy. He used to drive himself around in a limo. Which is just, you know, it's a funny, like he's driving himself, but it's a limo. But they would do all ages shows every Sunday. and I feel like I was probably there every week. Whether I was playing or spectating.
Yeah. Was that all metal at that point, or
was it what?
All metal at that point? You said that metal got you there initially.
Yeah, that was the early days for sure. But by the time stuff was going on over there, I wish I could remember what that place was called. It wasn't Exit Club? I think that was called the Exit Club. Huh. By that time, it was a little more variety. That's like the late 90s now, so people are more into grunge stuff and just kind of alternative leanings in all directions, whether it's kind of Sonic Youthy or a little more punk rock or whatever. It was an interesting group of bands back then.
What year did you graduate high school?
99.
99.
So this is like 97, 98.
Oh, I didn't realize you were a few years younger than me.
Yeah. But I remember like Jeff Lambert had a band back then called Moonhead Number 3. Some of those songs still get stuck in my head years later. A lot of the same characters that you see around were playing in bands back then. Bob Mendel, who he's kind of come full circle. He's a metal guy. He's everything guy. He likes everything, but as far as the music he makes, he's a metal guy. Mark Friedman, who plays with the Cassettes sometimes now. I remember him being in a band back then. So it's a lot of people I still know. Some of them are not as into music, but a lot of them are. But yeah, it was at that point. It wasn't metal, but a lot of us still had it in our pocket.
Yeah.
It's still rip out some shredder 2-hand tapping solos here and there in the middle of some weird like Chili Peppers funk tune.
And did you live in Boston when you went to Berklee?
Yeah, I lived in the dorms at first, and then I had a string of apartments with a bunch of different roommates, most of whom are still good friends of mine. And I came back here on a lot of weekends because I still had my group of friends here. I was in a band called T. Victrola for maybe the very end of high school and the first few years of college. It was Chris Haskell, myself, Mike Jupin, Eric Hodges, and is that it? Oh, well, Barry Chase for the first several years.
And what kind of music were you guys making?
That's a hard one to describe, but some people definitely thought of us as just kind of a Pearl Jam ripoff. We didn't think that. Someone described us one time as like a darker Blind Melon, and I thought that was pretty good.
Yeah.
Like if more Blind Melon songs were in minor keys. It was alternative rock. Yeah, for sure.
Yeah.
You could put it in that box. But it was all original, and we had a lot of fun with that.
So when you're in school at Berklee, you're doing the precursor to the current digital production, the synthesis major, but your primary is guitar. Do they have you studying like different genres at Berklee? I don't really know how Berklee works. I know like when I was at Lowell, they had like their thing that they did, and it was pretty rigid. They did like the same classical training that they've been doing there forever.
Sure. Berklee's always changing. It kind of has to. At the time when I was there, it was still primarily a jazz school. Like if you made it through your 4 semesters of required harmony classes, you understood subdominance and you knew your way around most jazz tunes. Whether you could keep up in a jam session is another thing, but you could sit down and you could work it out on paper at least. These days, I feel like it's changed a little bit. There's just, even then, when I was there, it was becoming a little less jazz-centric and more just like music proficiency in any way, whether it's pop or folk or whatever, you know. I mean, at this point, I have a lot of students that are mandolin principals and things like that, you know. Not that you can't play jazz on a mandolin, but it's not as
and they do.
Yeah, they do.
I've had a guy. I had you know that band Joy Kills Sorrow?
Nope.
They were all Berklee kids, and they had a bluegrass band, amazing bluegrass band. They came down here and played a show that we set up in New Bedford at one point in time. The mandolin player did things with a mandolin that I wouldn't have guessed possible, but he definitely could go back and forth between like kind of standard bluegrass stuff, straight up jazz, like really shreddy kind of stuff. Yeah.
It's awesome.
Yeah, he definitely can.
Yeah.
Yeah.
I got into the mandolin. You might remember this in the early days because maybe it was like 15 years ago at this point. But my whole idea was, this is tuned like a fiddle. It's kind of the same size. So I'll learn how to play the mandolin. And then within a year or two, I'll be playing the fiddle.
Yeah, yeah.
Now I've been playing the mandolin for 15 years and I still can't play the fiddle. You know, I never made the transition. But I do. I like the mandolin.
Yeah.
What that reminds me of, too, is just for some perspective, when I was a student at Berklee, I remember seeing Bela Fleck and the Flecktones. One semester they came to visit, and it was in one of the small little recital halls where students do their recitals. I don't know, maybe 40 to 50 seats in the room, and it wasn't filled, but it was a great show. You know, Flecktones were incredible. And then the next semester, it was in one of the larger recital rooms because they had gained a little bit more popularity. And there was a line out the door and around the corner. And then the next semester, which is still less than a year from the first time I saw them, they were in the BPC, which is like the big concert hall. And it was almost sold out. Yeah, yeah. You know? So that's the kind of era where I was there. You know, in the first few years, something like that seemed kind of silly. And then by the end, it was like, it's what people were into. Yeah. You know? So I kind of wandered from your original question there, but there's core classes at Berklee that you're going to take. Harmony, ear training, 2 semesters of conducting, which feels like a burden to a lot of students, but I gotta say it still helps me today when I'm trying to count things out, you know, trying to figure out like 1, 2.
Do you find it helps with starting tunes at tempo on stage and that kind of thing too? Do they give you some of that, like checking your heart rate for BPM and stuff?
Yeah, a little bit. For me, it's a little bit more like if I'm trying to figure out like if something's hitting on the end of 3, or if it's on, or if is that a bar of 7, or is that, you know, it just helps me to count things. I feel like it's maybe just a little bit more kinetic than counting on my fingers or something, you know. I don't know. But it's only because I did it so much that this is a great thing for an audio podcast. I'm talking with my hands here. They have you do it so much that it becomes automatic. Like I don't have to think about the direction that I'm conducting in 4/4, right? You know, or a bar of 3 is like, so it just makes it an easy way to count things out for me. Yeah, you know. And then you have your principal instrument, which is going to be 4 semesters of proficiencies. So that means you're taking private lessons, and the goal each semester is to pass your proficiency. And each semester it gets progressively more difficult. The first semester, they might have you play a few scales in certain positions, some chords, a prepared piece. And then the second, third, and fourth, those scales and chords get more advanced. The prepared pieces get more advanced, all that. If you're a performance major, then you do 8 semesters of that. So you go much further with the proficiencies and the private lessons. Most of us do just the 4 semesters because then we're investing our time and energy into a non-performance major. Like for me, it was the synthesis. For other people, it's songwriting or business or music therapy. Yeah. And then once you're in your major, there's going to be, it's like another smaller version where there's core classes that everyone in that major takes. And then there's electives, so you can still build your own version of it to some extent.
So somewhere in there, your alternative rock bands kind of transitioned to, or maybe it didn't transition, maybe alongside that, I heard you playing in College I've Jut.
Sure. Yeah,
That's probably 99-ish? 2000?
That's after I graduated and moved back.
Oh, so later than that.
So that's like the end of 99, I guess is what it is.
Okay.
So I think I graduated like summer 99, and then in the fall of 99, I was living down here. And
After college?
Yep.
Oh, okay. I thought you
So-
yeah, okay.
so
So you
I-
graduated college 99.
Yeah.
Oh, yeah. Okay. So actually we're the exact same age.
Okay. What did I say before?
I think you said you graduated high school 99 before, but
Oh yeah, you're right. I did.
that's all right.
Yeah, I graduated high school in 95.
Yeah, me too.
That's what it was.
Yeah.
Yeah. It's so long ago. At the time, that seemed like a big difference. So yeah, 99, I've graduated. I moved back here. I'd still been playing with Mike Jupin the whole time.
Mm-hmm.
His brother Nick was playing at the Cape Verdean Vets Club a lot.
Mm-hmm.
And so Mike Jupin and Nick Jupin went there a few times, and Mike Jupin got to know Marcus Montero, who at the time was probably 16, 17, but playing his butt off with the Vets, you know. And Mike Jupin had this idea to put together a band that would play like funk music, but kind of on the Maceo Parker side of things, you know, like a little jazzy. And Marcus was all about it. And so I don't remember who the first drummer was. It might have been Ryan Ribeiro, I think his name was. I'm not sure why it wasn't Nick Jupin at first. But so the three of them were playing, and they wanted somebody that could play chords. And at the time I was playing a lot of keyboards too, as well as guitar. So they're like, we'll get Brian Cass. And then Marcus and I hit it off and have been best of friends ever since. And we went through several drummers. After Ryan Ribeiro, we had John Farrell for quite a while. Did a bunch of gigs with him. I think we might have done a few gigs with Steve O'Grady, or at least one gig with Steve O'Grady. And then eventually Nick Jupin was the drummer. And that lasted for quite a while. And then when Nick retired for a bit, Pete Antunes joined the band. And I think that the longest run was probably that era where it was myself, Mike Jupin, Marcus Montero, Pete Antunes. And that band was one of the new wave cafe house bands.
Yeah,
you know,
yeah.
like you could say there was
Yeah.
3 or 4, because there were a few metal bands that would play once a month. We were like the funk band that would play once a month.
Yeah.
And we'd also play a lot of other gigs, and we used to rehearse above No Problemo downtown 4 to 5 nights a week. We would rehearse.
Yeah.
And we've developed like this telepathy that's still useful today. I just had a jam the other night because Pete Antunes was in town, and we went and hung out at Mike Jupin's, and we were playing stuff, and we can all just take a hard left with
Yeah.
just a quick glance around the room. You know, it's amazing how that sticks with you when you put in that much time together.
Now, were you using? I mean, that band definitely, like you said, has jazz elements. Is that stuff that you were using from your Berklee studies?
For sure, yeah. Marcus was definitely raised in a jazz household. His dad, Manny, is a big fan, and Marcus already had a strong ear for that when he was in high school. Not to mention just being a great player. The origins of that group really were we wanted to do jazz tunes, but sort of trick people into dancing to them. For example, there's the Miles Davis tune "All Blues," boom, ba-dum, 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 but we did it with like the P-Funk boom, ba-dum, bum, ba-dum, bum in 4/4. But we would do the whole form, the Miles Davis form. We did a lot of that, where we would take jazz tunes and kind of try to make it a little bit more palatable for the college crowd
Right.
in a groovy way. And in fact, the name, which is maybe our greatest weakness, Gala Jive Jut, Gala Jive Jut, Gala. There's so many different ways to say it, whatever. And, as the one that was doing the booking, I had to say that over the phone so many times and spell it for people so many times. I really grew to dislike the name. But where it came from was a friend of ours, Eric Costa, who was Jupin's roommate at the time. So he was always witnessing some of our rehearsals. He took the phrase special dance project, which he felt described our goals and our whole vibe. And he just ran it through his thesaurus. Special became gala, dance became jive. Project, I don't know if he did this on purpose or not, but he actually looked it up as project jut.
Oh.
That's
kind of cool.
I know. At the time, it's like the phonetics of it spoke to us, and we're like, yeah, sure, that's great, whatever.
Yeah.
But then after several years of being in that band, I kind of wish we spent a little more time on it.
That's a good name. I think that's a good name.
Yeah.
So this is an interesting phenomenon. So we are both speaking as musicians and probably speaking on a podcast to a mixed audience of people who are musicians and non-musicians. But Mike Jupin is one of those guys that always kind of blew my mind in that, like, I don't think he knows any of that theory stuff, right? Like, I feel like I've played with Mike and, like, mentioned a letter before, and he was just like, just play it. And I'll find what it is. How did that work, working with Marcus, who had a jazz background, yourself, who had Berklee jazz background, and then Mike, who's a really intuitive, amazingly accomplished musician? How are you guys communicating when you're putting things together?
That's a great question. I want to describe Jupin in a slightly different way. Because I know he does have a pretty strong foundation, but it ends at like the modes, if that makes sense. So, like, he understands a C versus a B flat.
Okay.
He understands Mixolydian versus Dorian. But if it gets, whenever there's something that maybe like changes keys, or there's like a modal interchange or subdominant, some kind of like something that breaks out, because he's really familiar with just those, the Ionian, Dorian, Phrygian kind of, the modes, which I was going to try to clarify that for any of the less musically inclined people and say diatonic, but that doesn't probably help at all.
Yeah, well, I mean, there are different colored scales. Right?
Yeah.
Scales that paint in different colors.
So he's very comfortable with those forms. But if something breaks out of that, I think that's a specialized moment for him that he has to, because he's, I don't know if that makes any sense.
I think it makes sense. I mean, I'm just thinking you guys were doing some pretty heady stuff.
Right.
In a lot of places.
Yeah. So for him, I think he's thinking about it probably a similar way to I am, which is that at this moment I'm in F mixo, at this moment I'm in D flat mixo, and it's kind of, it's almost like there's a lot of key changes in a jazz form when you think of it like that,
Yeah.
And whereas Marcus definitely has he's in a higher hot air balloon, and he's seeing it all a little bit more like just, there's 12 notes,
Yeah.
You sprinkle them in however you want, because he just has such a good ear for it too,
Mm-hmm.
And then the other end of the spectrum is like Quinn Sullivan, who I've been playing with more recently, and I played with since he was 3 years old, right?
Mm-hmm.
We were playing a Hendrix tune a few weeks back, and I started saying the chords to him, and he's like, I'll just, he's one of those guys that is 200% ear.
Oh, really?
He doesn't even really want to know what chords I'm playing.
Yeah.
But he will not play a wrong note the whole time. He knows what they sound like before he gets his fingers on them, so he's as intuitive as you can be on that end of it. But so to go back to your question, a lot of the time, when we were writing material with Gala Jive Jut, it would start with either me or Marcus or Jupin. And when you go back and you check out some of our original stuff, you can really, it's pretty clear like an entire tune doesn't always come from one person, but different pieces of tunes you can hear. Oh, that has Jupin written all over it. That has Marcus written all. You can hear the different styles. But we did learn to communicate pretty well on different levels. There were definitely times where Marcus is presenting things that I couldn't quite wrap my head around, and I think there's times where I'm presenting things that Jupin couldn't wrap his head around. But we could work it out. Mm-hmm. And then rhythmically, and I was reminded of this again just the other night, Pete and Jupin can hit these pockets that, they're so deep in a groove, but then every 4 bars they hit this one 30-second note anticipation. And they both hit it perfectly every time. Whenever those two guys would get to practice early before Marcus and I, they'd always come up with some crazy like kind of oblong groove, but they'd have it locked in, so a lot of that would happen. And Jupin's also really good at just kind of keeping the grid in mind, meaning we'll be playing through something, he'll be like, no, that was 64 bars. Like, not that he was counting all 64 bars, but he's counting groups of 8 or whatever he's doing, I don't know. But you can almost always look to him form wise for like, is this where we change? He usually knows.
I always felt like he was really good at steering.
Yep.
Like I would hear bands that he was playing with. I've seen him play with a bunch of people over the years, yourself and other folks, and I always say to people, like, listen, the things that you hear on top are not gonna be what's gonna make this thing that's kind of like one chordy right now change. Listen to what Mike does. Mm-hmm. When he moves, everybody's going with him, Mm-hmm. And I feel like did he play with oh man, what was the name of the dance band there that Jude was in?
It started as Oniris and then it became Grand Army.
Yeah, was he the bass player in there?
Yeah.
Yeah. And he definitely, like, that band could get into those kind of like lengthy one chord kind of drony, like there's only the beat kind of thing. Mm-hmm. And the thing that would make it transform was wherever he pulled it,
For sure.
Yeah.
Yep. Yeah, and that was I don't mean to sound like I'm dissing on Adam Colucci, because I think Adam's a great drummer. But in that band, Adam was doing a lot of 4 on the floor, a lot of pretty simple stuff.
Yeah.
And it's true that Jupin was kind of like the connective tissue between a lot of those pretty simple grooves to make them like bob and weave a lot more. That's a good combo, Adam and Mike there.
Yeah. So, did you ever? Well, I kind of know the answer to this. I've seen you do work with electronic music with Marcus. Mm-hmm. Did you ever bring the synthesizers and the electronic music stuff into Gala Jive Shot, or is that kind of like...
that might have been what killed that band.
Oh, okay.
No, so after a while, I think everybody kind of had their, I don't know, their own distractions at the time. But one of the things that I kept getting more and more into bringing in computers and and to be honest, kind of experimental electronic elements. I had been using the Chaos Pad a lot in that band, which is like it's like a DJ effect. It's a tabletop XY kind of pad that you can sample into and stuff. And so I'd get kind of weird with that. But I started getting a little bit weirder still, bringing my computer and stuff. And sometimes it just got a little bit over the top. Mm. But at the same time, I was kind of drawn to like, I think that's what I want to do. Fast forward many years, I realize it does fit together. The technology maybe wasn't where it is now, and my ability to blend the things was maybe not where it is now. But I don't feel like I was wrong in wanting to do that. In hindsight,
so were you grabbing samples of what was happening in real time and then throwing them back out there?
Yeah, we had this crazy, interesting setup. John Farrell was doing sound for us most of the time. Mm-hmm. And John Farrell does a lot of theater production, so he has a lot of wireless packs, for actors.
Yeah.
And So I'd use this Chaos pad on stage, which is a sampler that allows me to play the sample back, like forward, backwards, and kind of scratch it like a turntable. And I would have the receiver plugged in to one of my inputs on there. And John would be at the soundboard, whether it was the New Wave or some other club, it didn't matter, because he's got the battery pack. He's got the transmitter. He's got a little 1/4-inch cable. He plugs it into the board, and then he can send me any mic that's on stage. So I can give him a hand signal. I can look over at him and just do like a saxophone hand signal. And now he's feeding the saxophone into my sampler. So I could record the saxophone and start trading fours with Marcus where I'm playing back his recording. Or I could give him like a hi-hat hand cymbal and he'd give me the hi-hat in my sampler and I could record that. We had a lot of fun with that.
Yeah.
And I don't think that was really pushing the boundaries so much. It was more like when I started bringing the computer and like, because then everybody's sitting around waiting for me to like troubleshoot things, and that's where it got a little tricky.
Well, I love that idea of incorporating the digital elements into the live performance. I fell in love last year with the Sylvanesso stuff. Do you know that band?
I think you sent that to me a few months ago.
Yeah, there's
yeah, it was cool.
The recorded stuff's wonderful too. I mean, it's like it's really great music, but live it's that same idea. Like he's using like Ableton and synthesizers and samplers and like throwing her voice back at her while she's singing, you know, and that kind of thing. And and so there's like an improvised element to the live performance with the electronic and with the samples and that kind of thing. So yeah, super cool. Are you using that with the cassettes at all?
Sometimes, yeah. I've got if you look behind you, there's a large rifle case on the floor. That's my pedal board. Yeah. And it's pretty modular in that I switch it around a lot. Sometimes I use a talk box in there. Sometimes I bring a little keyboard. Sometimes I use a harmonizer on the vocals. I've got this funny pedal that's like it's like a sidechain effect. So I can throw a mic in the kick drum and that goes into the sidechain input. And then if I just sustain a guitar chord, it will duck my chord every time he hits the kick. So it gives that kind of electronic sound where it's like my guitar's pumping in rhythm with the drums. So I just hold the chord and it kind of ooh, 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 every time he hits the drum. And I can also run the keyboard through that. And I have over the years, I've enjoyed doing that goofy thing where I play guitar with my left hand and the keys with my right hand. So I can do little, back to Iron Maiden, parallel third harmonies, but improvise with them. Because if you use a harmonizer on your guitar, it sounds cool and all, but you can't like change the harmony. You can't go in different directions and stuff. But if you're playing it in real time, you can mess around with it. You can be playing fifths, then thirds, then octaves, you know.
You're Roland Kirk with a keyboard and a guitar.
Doing my best, yeah. And that led me to a few different things. One is using a sustainer pickup in my guitar so that playing with just my left hand works better. You know, the strings will just kind of resonate. And that turned into a whole other thing. I now absolutely love using the sustainer on my electric guitar. That's even if I'm not using the keyboard with it, that's like a whole other electronic thing, because I use it with the kill switch too, so it gets a little Rage Against the Machine kind of thing happening there. But even just doing things like having a sustain pedal on the keyboard so I can play a chord and play over it with my guitar, and then every now and then reach over and change the chord and then, you know, keep playing guitar. Little stuff like that. I do a good amount with the cassettes. I haven't done as much of the sampling or the Chaos Pad stuff, but it happens sometimes. I definitely use some guitar synthesizer kind of sounds so I can get synthesizerly for sure. But when it comes to the more electronic stuff, that's a group that is a little more dormant and just we poke our heads up every here and there, called the Overclock Orchestra, which originally was just me and Pete Antunes, and sometimes it was just me. I thought it was funny to call it an orchestra when there was either one or two people. And the last few things we've done, Marcus has been involved as well. And that's where it's really like we've got clicks in our ears, and we have a very specific kind of through composed thing, but there's always going to be large planned chunks of improvisation. And there's sampling, and there's and Pete's usually using a what do you call that, SPD or some other kind of sample trigger, so he can from the drum kit he can trigger samples as well. You know, and we can integrate all that stuff together so that it's so it's a band and we're performing live, but there's also I wouldn't say that there's like playback, there's not like tracks that we're playing to, but there's little samples and one shots that we can trigger along the way. And also like live looping too, so we can record something we've done and let that loop while we play other stuff. Yeah. That's what the Overclock Orchestra gets into normally.
Yeah. So we're actually coming up on time. What's next for you? Any big plans on the horizon?
I want to perform more. I want to do more of what we were just describing, which is like using the electronics in performance with other live musicians. I mean, I like doing the one-man band thing. I always have. But I like playing in a band.
Yeah.
I've been doing some acoustic stuff with John Fernandez. Just playing the mandolin again. So that's been fun to kind of get my acoustic fix, because I've always liked to have some amount of that.
Yeah.
Keeps me balanced. But I have a meeting tonight with some friends of mine from Providence. We're gonna try to start a new band. This is right up your alley. Something that I've liked to do before, and I know you've done a lot of this. Basically, live scoring films.
Oh,
right?
yeah. So
we want to do an instrumental. This is probably something that'll be like Halloween 2023. So like October, later this year, I think we'd be trying to book some performances around. So we're going to watch a film tonight that we think is going to be the one that we want to do. But this is like our first. We haven't played a single note yet.
Yeah.
But I think I'll probably be playing some bass, some guitar, some computer, you know. And that's with a drummer and another guy that's like primarily keyboards, but could also be doing other computer stuff too. So I'm looking forward to that.
Yeah, that sounds awesome.
Yeah.
Very cool. All right. Well, thanks for taking the time.
Sure.
Yeah, man. Been talking with Brian Cass, and you can catch him with the Cassettes, playing in downtown New Bedford frequently, and hopefully we'll be able to catch this awesome film-scored project in fall of next year too. And keep your eyes peeled and your ears open. Signing off. Talk to you soon.
See ya.
We'll see you next week for another episode of the South Coast Artist Index podcast. To learn more about the South Coast Artist Index, visit theartistindex.com. Find us on Facebook, Instagram, and YouTube.